Lyra Ven had survived 43 days on Kthra Prime by following one simple rule: avoid the apex predators. The Rokar were magnificent creatures, sleek, six-limbed hunters with crystalline eyes and intelligence that rivaled most sentient species. They weren't just animals. They were people in their own right, even if the galaxy hadn't recognized them as such yet. So when Lyra's emergency shuttle crashed in the crimson forests of their territory, she'd kept her distance. She'd scavenged, she'd hidden, she'd survived, until the day she found the cubs. They were huddled beneath a fallen titan tree, three small Rokar no bigger than earth wolves, mewling pitifully. Their mother was nowhere to be seen unusual for a species known for their fierce parental instincts. Lyra watched from behind a cluster of phosphorescent ferns, knowing she should walk away. Getting involved with Rokar young was asking for trouble. Then the smallest one looked directly at her with those prismatic eyes, and she heard it whimper. Damn it. She approached slowly, hands raised, making herself as non-threatening as a human could look to alien predators. The cubs tensed but didn't flee. Hungry, they were starving. Their ribs showed through their still downy fur, and their movements were lethargic. Lyra knelt at the edge of their shelter and carefully placed 3 protein bars, her last ones on the ground. The cubs sniffed the offering, then devoured it with desperate efficiency. That's how it started. By day 7, the cubs, she'd mentally named them Scout, Prowler, and Tiny had begun following her back to her makeshift camp. By day 10, they'd moved in completely. Lyra told herself it was temporary, that their mother would return. But as days became weeks, she accepted the truth. She was now the guardian of 3 baby apex predators, and she was running out of food. The morning it happened, Lyra was showing the cubs how to identify edible fungi. Her stomach had been empty for 16 hours, and as she bent over a particularly promising cluster of mushrooms, her body betrayed her. Growl, the sound echoed through the clearing like thunder. All 3 cubs froze. 6 crystalline eyes locked onto Lyra's midsection. Scout's ears pinned back. Prowler dropped into a defensive crouch. Tiny released a high-pitched trill, the Rokar distress call. "Oh, no, it's okay," Lyra said quickly, pressing a hand to her stomach. "It's just, I'm hungry." "It's a human thing," Grumble, Scout hissed, circling Lyra with hackles raised. Prowler began making a deep clicking sound in his throat, the noise adult Rokar made when confronting threats. Tiny scrambled behind a rock. Lyra realized with growing horror what was happening. The cubs thought something was inside her. Something alive. Something dangerous. "It's just my stomach," she insisted, but Scout lunged forward and pressed his head against her abdomen, listening intently. His eyes widened. "Oh God, they think I'm possessed." What followed was perhaps the most absurd week of Lyra's life. The cubs became her constant guards, never letting her out of their sight. They brought her food, mostly things she couldn't eat, like raw Kthran swamp rats and something that looked disturbingly like purple intestines, and watched anxiously as her stomach continued its periodic rumbling. Scout developed a habit of pressing his ear to her belly before she slept, as if monitoring the internal creature. Prowler would growl threateningly at her midsection whenever it made noise. Tiny, the most anxious of the 3, began sleeping directly on top of Lyra's stomach, apparently trying to suppress the creature through sheer weight. Lyra tried everything to explain. She drew diagrams in the dirt. She made eating gestures and pointed to her stomach. She even tried recording her stomach sounds and playing them back to show they weren't alive. Nothing worked. Then one evening, as Lyra was attempting to roast a tuber over her small fire, her stomach produced its loudest growl, yet a gurgling, rumbling symphony of hunger that seemed to last forever. The cubs went berserk. Scout and Prowler positioned themselves on either side of Lyra, snarling at her stomach. Tiny leaped onto her shoulders, shrieking. And then, from the forest shadows, came an answering call. An adult Rokar emerged from the tree line, and Lyra's heart stopped. It was massive, easily 3 times the size of an earth lion, with scars crossing its shoulders and a crystalline eye that was slightly clouded, the mark of an elder. Roarin, she'd heard the indigenous Kthran colonists speak of him in hushed tones, the territorial alpha of this entire forest sector. The creature that had probably killed most of her fellow crash survivors. The cubs rushed to him, trilling and clicking, their small bodies pressed against his massive legs. Roran lowered his great head, touching noses with each cub in turn. Then those ancient eyes turned to Lyra. She didn't run. There was no point. If Roran wanted her dead, she'd been dead since the day she crashed. The alpha predator approached slowly, each footfall deliberate. The cubs danced around him, clearly agitated, pointing toward Lyra and making distressed sounds. Scout actually pressed against Roran's foreleg and then gestured toward Lyra's stomach. "They're telling him about the creature." Roran stopped 2 meters away. He tilted his head, studying her with an intelligence that made Lyra's breath catch. Then he did something unexpected. He sat. It was such a deliberately non-threatening posture that Lyra almost laughed. This apex predator, this legendary hunter, had sat down like a patient house cat. "I don't suppose you speak English?" Lyra ventured. Roran's ear twitched. Then Lyra's stomach growled again, long, low, and incredibly loud in the evening quiet. The cubs yelped. Prowler actually tried to push Lyra away from Roran, as if protecting the alpha from the dangerous human with the internal monster. But Roran didn't react with fear or aggression. Instead, he made a sound Lyra had never heard before, a series of soft, rhythmic chuffs. It took her a moment to realize what it was. He's laughing. The ancient predator stood and patted to his cubs, touching each with his muzzle in what Lyra could only interpret as reassurance. Then he turned and disappeared into the forest. 5 minutes later, he returned with a fresh Kthra deer analog, cleanly taken. He dropped it at Lyra's feet, then looked pointedly at her stomach. The message was clear: feed your internal creature before it eats you from the inside. Lyra later learned that Roran had been watching her since the crash, observing how she'd cared for his cubs when their mother had been killed by a territorial rival. The cubs had essentially adopted her, and in Rokar culture that made her family. The stomach incident became legendary among the local Rokar packs, the human with the creature inside that demanded constant feeding. But it also became something else. Proof that humans were worthy pack members, strange as they were. When the rescue ship finally arrived 3 months later, Lyra declined evacuation. She had responsibilities. She had cubs to raise. And she had an alpha who still brought her food every time her stomach growled, just to be safe. The galaxy would eventually recognize the Rokar as sentient. But Lara Ven was the first human to be recognized by them, the strange two-legged creature with the mysterious internal beast that somehow never managed to eat its way out. She couldn't have asked for a better reputation.